Grand Cathay faces peril. The ruinous powers carve up and defile its lands. Skaven gnaw through its innards, while ogres run rampant on its borders. The Iron Dragon watches his lands succumb to havoc. The peaceful approach failed. All he could do was pray. Pray that Bhashiva could kill all of Cathay's enemies before his nation fell. The Chaos Gods play their cruel games, but she will have no part in them. The world is crumbling. The lands of man, dwarf, and elf are being swept away. Cathay will not go down with a whimper, but with a ferocious, primal roar. This is my narrative campaign for Bhashiva, the desert tigress and unflinching warden of Grand Cathay. The Mountains of Morn separated Grand Cathay from the countless dangers of the world, a natural barrier, if not for all the ogre tribes infesting the range. But there was a simple solution: just kill them. The ogres were used to the grueling slopes, but the Cathayans persevered, driven by pride for their homeland and fear of their tigress leader. Bhashiva would never hurt her people, of course, but it's difficult to not be a tad uneasy around one who can carve through time, space, and ogres in the blink of an eye. The mountains were lawless, and it was Bhashiva's charge to tame them. Her benefactor Zhao Ming lent aid and direction to her savage campaign. There were rumblings of relics strewn across the land that would bring Kamal's favor if reclaimed. A nearby ogre settlement held one such artifact, and Bhashiva moved to seize it before the brutes tried to sell, bash, or eat it. The Tigermen advanced with an eerie calm, while the ogres thrashed their weapons and threw insults and boasts. After a slow advance, the Tigermen erupted, carving a bloody rift through the ogre ranks. Amidst the lingering haze of gore and bits of Noblar, the biggest, meanest, ugliest ogre bellowed a challenge to Bhashiva, promising to carve the flesh from her bones if he got her hands on her. Those threats did not come into fruition. The ogres were driven out of their ramshackle town. The livery of the White Tiger was raised, a challenge to all within the mountains. This land had a new warden. Bhashiva reclaimed the relic in the Tiger God's honor, and more orders came from the Iron Dragon. The ogres were gathering their strength on Yeti Peak. Stop them. The Cathayans were growing accustomed to the frigid peaks, almost alien compared to the sweltering jungles of Ind. The Tigermen learned that the rules of war remain and that the stupidity of ogres never changes. The brutes roared onto the field, leaving their blubbery underbellies exposed for an unexpected counterattack. The ogres, isolated and surrounded, fell to the onslaught. What started as lone, tactical attacks against camps and warbands became a systematic, relentless purge. Bhashiva saw this as the only way, and that caused tensions to flare. Zhao Ming saw an alternative. He believed they could be reasoned with, brought to heel, and subjugated. He waxed lyrical about the sun and the stars and a nation under heaven, and harmony and peace and dragons and wolves and cattle, and Bhashiva had stopped listening moments into his very long speech. She ignored all his metaphors and went off to kill every single ogre she could get her claws on. Pushed down to the lowlands, the ogres mustered ever larger war parties. Most sensed the inevitable press of civilization on their unruly way of life. A few were just bored and hungry, but the gathering numbers did little to slow the brutal cull. Zhao Ming met the mass ogre extermination with grim reservation, but others approved of Bhashiva's straightforward approach. An isolated dwarf hold cheered the White Tiger on, and there were stirrings of a budding friendship, though the blossoming relationship would have to wait. There was a reason these mountains had run lawless for generations. Well, hundreds of reasons really, but the biggest, meanest, and greenest one unveiled himself. Grimgor Ironhide had watched the Cathayan purge with an intense interest. He threw his forces into the mix, not in an act of solidarity with the ogres. No, he did not care about them in the slightest. He butchered the town of Titan's Notch with callous indifference, and the grave injustice brought a champion to Bhashiva's door. Taoyan the Merciless demanded blood for Grimgor's insolence, and Bhashiva was all too happy to invite her into her retinue and point her in the general direction of the Greenskin War. Bhashiva's forces were intent on dealing justice for the slaughter of Titan's Notch. The orcs had already forgotten they'd done this, but they were eager for a good scrap anyway. The thrashing anger of the Greenskins rippled through the earth, and the Cathayans could do little but watch and wait. Many imagined the worst, but some were as eager as the Greenskins for the coming violence. In an act of symbolic, reckless stupidity, the orcs launched some goblins at the Cathayans' ranks, and then their anticipation boiled over. The war charged. A group of trolls hurtled into the shield wall, carving a brutal trench through the humans. Boar boys barreled into a vulnerable flank, but the Tigermen stopped their charge dead. Bhashiva singled out Grimgor. She knew a single swing of that dreadful axe could hew her in two. She dodged his strikes with blistering speed, and the intensity of the war boss resonated from him like a hurricane. Bhashiva knew she could match metal with the orc, but all around, her followers were overwhelmed. What was worth more to her pride or her people? It pained her, but she signaled the retreat. Her lieutenants would have fought to the bitter end at her wish, but they'd be dying in vain. No, as long as Cathay stood, so would they. This resounding victory marked the first stage of the orcs' grand plan. They intended to topple Cathay, and then the world, and then they'd probably go after the moon, knowing them. But that's orcs for you. The smart ones might think about tomorrow, but most are only concerned with that very moment, and whether or not they had something to punch. They did not understand how this seemingly monumental victory was the start of their undoing. The war was a terrible sight as a whole, but over-eager and short-sighted, individual isolated warbands were picked off and dismantled. The Cathayans didn't face Grimgor in the flesh as he'd have liked. They fought their way and forced a slow, painful bleed out through countless precise cuts. This pleased Zhao Ming greatly, who'd already forgotten about Bhashiva's rejection of his ogre peace plan, and he continued to heap praise and support on the White Tiger and her followers. A steady stream of reports came in, all pointing towards Grimgor amassing a mighty force near the ruined dwarf hold of Karak Vrag. The war of attrition had taken its toll, and while the orc was too stupid to understand it, he was vulnerable to a decisive strike, which Bhashiva would deliver. The war boss was eager, confident, and boastful, but he never was one for seeing the bigger picture. A hail of crossbow fire showered his encroaching force, each shot biting deep into flesh and sending plumes of viscera into the icy air. Undeterred, the war boss erupted into the Cathayan line. As before, he carved a path of ruin through the humans. But now they knew the Black Orc bled just like any other, and they held their ground. The melee spilled across the plains and into the nearby forest. A hidden Tigerman detachment pounced, led personally by Bhashiva. The orcs wanted blood, and she would give them gallons. Grimgor's war was astounding. Battle carpeted the hills in every direction. The orcs fought with the intensity of cornered, feral beasts. But the cold composure of the Cathayans matched them blow for blow. Grimgor sent sprays of gore with every catastrophic blow of his axe, but the humans would not back down. To the surprise of all, Grimgor turned and ran, and the flash of cowardice left him exposed for a fatal strike. The spears that had held him back moments earlier drove deep, and the great orc toppled to the earth. But there was little time to reflect on this monumental day. Stirrings of another ogre uprising reached Bhashiva, though they came with a troubling footnote. Her new dwarf friends had been eradicated. Suddenly very protective and very angry, Bhashiva growled a harsh vendetta against the ogres, and just as she was forming a plan, a memo came from Shangyang. Nobles captured, ogres hungry, please rescue. P.S. Lots of ogres to kill. Love, Ming. The hastily scrawled notes brought a big, toothy grin to the tigress's face. She had some very important Cathayans to save. The camp teemed with the warbands of a half-dozen ogre tribes, and a reckless assault was suicide. Bhashiva issued a meticulous set of orders: isolate and destroy, bit by bit. The dense undergrowth was home to unpleasant infestations of noblars, and the Tigermen took no pleasure in their extermination. Well, a little pleasure. The assault continued. The Tigermen collapsed on another band of ogres, though their eagerness was met with an obstacle they had no answer to. Ogres with cannons, blasting devastating shots point-blank into their ranks. Cathayans are, of course, renowned for their mastery of black powder and gunnery tactics, and outgunning an ogre was child's play. Unfortunately, Bhashiva's retinue had left all their guns at home and had to resort to the slightly more dangerous tactic of run directly at the cannons. Surprisingly, it worked, and they forced the lead belchers back. This was a rescue mission. She didn't care about who, why, or how. She just needed to free the captives. The Tiger Queen drew up a simple plan and stuck to it. Kill everyone everywhere and try not to kill the hostages. It proved remarkably effective, and while the tigress and her retinue were killing everyone everywhere, the captives made a break for it and managed to not get killed. War horns bellowed from the pinnacle of the camp. The Cathayans rushed to meet the gathering storm, and ogres atop savage Rhinoxen tore down the slope. It was a whip-crack attack that left the humans and the Tigermen reeling, but after regaining themselves, they repelled the monstrous cavalry. With no time to reposition, yet more terrible colossal beasts set upon them. A towering stonehorn approached, and the crossbowmen readied and fired a single devastating volley. The bolts bit deep, but it did not stop the behemoth's charge. Its wounds caught up with it though, and after a second volley, it succumbed and collapsed to the earth with a seismic boom. That accounted for roughly half of the Cathayans' troubles, as a gargantuan thunder tusk was churning a whirlpool of devastation. The bigger the beast, the greater the fall. A mantra Bhashiva knew all too well, and when she was done with it, it hit the ground with an impact that shook the very mountainside. But the shaking did not stop. The last few ogres ran for the hills, replaced by a sea of hulking, fresh bodies. The Cathayans were in tatters. They were exhausted, broken, and bloodied. Even Bhashiva felt the cruel lash of fate sting her psyche. They'd make their stand. It was their duty. But Zhao Ming had not forgotten about them. From the other side of the valley came a very different din. The sound of 1,000 proud sons and daughters of Grand Cathay. The days of ogres taking advantage of them were over. Reinvigorated, Bhashiva's retinue stood alongside the fresh Cathayan army and braced. The ensuing battle was immense and horrific. Havoc blanketed the land. The dust kicked up by the carnage left a coarse fog in the battle's epicenter. In the nightmarish scene, monsters fell one by one. The hills would soon teem with the patchwork remains of a dozen shattered ogre tribes. And sure enough, they'd all find a banner to march under. Bhashiva had unknowingly granted a meteoric rise to power to Greasus Goldtooth.
I'll pick my teeth with your bloody bones.
He'd clutched onto the scattered remains of the ogre tribes and brought them together under his charge. The downtrodden ogres were rallied and pointed at their obvious enemy. Once more, they charged recklessly into the Cathayans, and once more they relied solely on raw, brute strength. Greasus was in the center of a churning mass of bodies, and with a heavy score to settle, Taoyan the Merciless found her mark and advanced. His great gilded club sent bodies cascading, but she was undaunted. Bhashiva came to her aid, and they pressed the ogre tyrant back with a constant and deadly assault. Greasus, re-evaluating his entire plan, attempted a tactical retreat, but as his back turned, Bhashiva struck, sending his heaving mass spilling into the snow. Greasus's defeat marked a tremulous sense of peace across the mountains of Morn, but it wouldn't last long. Weeks of intense fighting had left a trail of destruction as far as the eye could see, and where there are battlefields, there are diseases and parasites and vermin. All across Cathay, esophagi into the earth's innards gurgled and retched forth swarms of Skaven. Raiding parties sporting the tattered livery of Clan Trickery assaulted the mountains of Morn. They'd played their hand, and Bhashiva played hers. They scurried through the winding chasms of the mountain, blind to the dangers of their environment. A few weeks prior, and Bhashiva was a stranger to these lands, but this unforgiving terrain had tempered her. Clan Trickery grew desperate. They had plans for Grand Cathay, but upon learning that they could not do whatever they wanted with no repercussions, they had come up with a plan B. And they opted for the surprisingly courageous strategy of facing the Cathayans in cold, honest combat. Bhashiva might have admired this acceptance of fate had it come from literally any other living thing in the cosmos. But the Skaven? No. There was some insidious plan at work here, and she'd find out what it was. The Ratmen surged towards the humans, and after a visceral charge onto their spear line, the field broke into a mass of close, bloody combat. More Skaven tore down the hills into the Cathayans, but Bhashiva was already there, carving ruin through the reinforcements. The Skaven fought and died. Finally, they had discovered a shred of courage. Bhashiva was impressed, briefly, until she realized that the Skaven had not suddenly invented bravery. This was merely a distraction keeping her busy, while a bigger, stronger, and more important clan attacked Zhao Ming. A Skaven tide was unleashed upon her benefactor's lands, and death and disease followed. An inevitable creeping pestilence spread in the Skaven's wake, and Nurgle sent his most prized lieutenants to oversee the distribution of his gifts. Kugarth had come, and Zhao Ming faced existential threats from all directions. He asked for aid, and Bhashiva delivered it. She sent troops to reinforce the Iron Dragon, but the Grandfather of Plagues was intent on seeing that support hindered. Little could prepare the Cathayans for Nurgle's menagerie of unholy design. Towering above the battlefield, a chaos giant dripping in toxic ooze smashed, pounded, and spewed ruin across the battlefield. The front line was a swirling mix of steel and rotten meat, so potent it made the Cathayans gag. The pox-marked skin of Nurgle's champions would routinely rupture, spraying rancid pus that coated the battlefield. Despite the overwhelming odds, the Cathayans repelled the assault. They sent the demons back to whichever sickening circle of hell they crawled from, while more earthly horrors simply keeled over and died. Zhao Ming was grateful for the aid, though the perilous situation unfolding had been good for business, and the Iron Dragon's lands now stretched far into the Cathayan heartland. Bhashiva's forces were still recovering from the Chaos assault, and she prayed for some respite before the next one. But alas, the whims of the gods did not agree. Kugarth had come. The twisted, bubonic architect of suffering made it his personal charge to bring Grand Cathay choking to its knees. He would make their final few moments on Earth truly miserable. Or so was his plan. His repulsive legion crashed upon a defiant wall of steel. Flying beasts addled with disease hummed across the field as the valley erupted into the sound of clashing metal and rupturing flesh. A suffocating miasma clung to the air, and any human that fell into the virulent mist would not return to their feet. But the Cathayans had learned an all-important lesson from their campaigns against the ogres. This time, they brought guns, and they shredded the flying beasts to ribbons. Kugarth had expected them to buckle, but when pressed, the Cathayans pushed back with even greater force. While he fixated on the battlefield, Bhashiva tore towards him. Kugarth conjured wave after wave of objectionable demonkin to slow down the tigress, but she carved through them effortlessly. No matter which part of his body he spewed forth vile concoctions, the assault did not slow, and he was overwhelmed. His forces scurried back to the cursed land from whence they came, but this was not the last Bhashiva would hear from the plague god. The list of enemies eager to attack Cathay was a long one. Repel one, and another took its place. For as long as Cathay stood, it garnered the gaze of chaos and destruction. Bhashiva would not remain stationary and invite calamity. That is not the way of Kamal nor the White Tiger. She would lash out before her enemies knew what hit them. Strike first, strike hard, no mercy. That's an old Tigerman proverb. Pretty catchy, eh? As her foes repositioned, she lay in wait and pounced. What might have been a horrific attack on some poor town was dismantled in minutes as man and tiger alike descended on the fetid invaders. It wasn't just the forces of chaos that garnered her wrath. All of Cathay's enemies were to be cut down. Another Skaven clan sought to gnaw on the bones of Cathay, but Clan Rictus would learn a very important life lesson. It's best to wait for your food to be dead or at least dying before you take a bite. Every step they took invited the fury of Bhashiva. They would leave or die. Frankly, the tigress did not care which. This land would see peace, even if she had to kill half the world to achieve it. Cathay's enemies sought to divide her and her spoils. The Blessed Dread, a blasphemous group of slavers, cheats and murderers, led by the blasphemous, slaving, murdering cheat Lokir Felheart, declared war on Zhao Ming. The Taoyan supported both Elf and Chaos, forming a wicked triumvirate united against Grand Cathay. Oh, and there was also the Skaven, but they'd been pretty useless and would tire themselves out eventually. The Skaven were relegated to the sidelines. As the forces of Nurgle closed in, they'd positioned hell cannons to bombard the Cathayans. A dense forest separated the armies, and if the Cathayans circumvented the thicket, Chaos Knights were ready and waiting to mow them down. Bhashiva was cornered, and she didn't like it one bit. She ordered her forces into the woods. The hell cannons rained infernal rounds down upon them, but they kept forward. Plague drones swooped in to halt their advance, but the Cathayans dragged them into the vegetation, away from the hellfire which hailed down on them. She thrust the spear straight and true, and buried the dagger deep in the ribs. The Tigermen met the Chaos Knights with no fear or hesitation, dragging the champions of Nurgle down to earth and ripping them to shreds. Bhashiva pressed on, while the forest fighters bought her time. Whatever the Tigress needed, they'd provide. With Taoyan at the epicenter, they fought with a severity that had the Chaos forces reeling. It was a devastating blow for the armies of Nurgle. It would take a lot more than this to bring Grand Cathay to her knees. The world was crumbling. Kislev had fallen. The Empire burned. Northern Cathay was a smoldering husk. Ruin brought her nation's allies low. But Cathay would hold. It must. She'd intended to send forces to reinforce Zhao Ming when her scholars came with troubling revelations. She had been tricked. The idols she'd been scouring the mountains for, they were a ruse. The agents of Tzeentch had planted them. Their sole purpose was to keep her away from Cathay and his unfolding designs. Tzeentch's forces had ravaged northern Cathay, and Bhashiva had done nothing to stop it. So fixated on her immediate troubles that she'd lost track of the bigger picture. Cathay was falling. Only Zhao Ming held, but for how long? Even if she came to his aid, then what? Tzeentch to the north, the Druki to the east, all supported by the Taoyan from the Chaos Wastes. It was only a matter of time. Bhashiva had a plan in mind. One she refrained from telling Zhao Ming, lest he call her a lunatic.
There is nothing I want but your obliteration.
Without permission, nor reinforcement, nor much planning at all, Bhashiva ordered a surprise attack against the Chaos forces gathering north of her. She'd entrusted a celestial general to lead the assault, and his forces struck ferociously. warriors who'd been drilling for weeks in the hostile conditions fought with valiant resolve against the Chaos Warriors. Buffeted by howling winds, Jade Lancers roared across the frozen plains, tearing down the brutish nomad horsemen. The forces of Chaos had grown bold. They were enacting their own plans for the world, and they expected Cathay to buckle and break like Kislev and the Empire. And maybe they would one day. Maybe the ruinous powers would prove too much and overwhelm all that was good and fair. But not before Cathay got in a few punches of her own. The strike against Kolak Sun-Eater was a decisive moment, and as the gods turned their gaze north, Bhashiva sent a second force to carve a passage to northern Cathay. The land had suffered wounds it might never recover from. If they couldn't save it, at least they could punish the perpetrators. A violent melee stretched across the desert, groaning back and forth. Lancers took advantage of the engaged Chaos champions, tearing into their backs with devastating charges. They tore into the fray again and again, until the Chaos forces could take no more and drew back. The victory drew the ire of Tzeentch, but this was merely the precursor to a more cataclysmic, all-encompassing war that would swallow the land whole. Bhashiva had made her opening gambit, and the ruinous powers answered. A horde of beasts and tainted men descended on an ill-prepared garrison who'd sallied out to meet them. These were civilians defending their homes, the lower caste who took up arms at the infinitesimal odds that they might stand against the unchecked wrath of the Sun-Eater. The havoc unleashed upon them was devastating. A few soldiers were lucky enough to possess armor and training, but they were chaff to the cruelty of the Chaos Knights. But their sacrifice wasn't in vain. It brought time for a force to turn back from its northern campaign and take back the town. The very general who'd snatched victory from the Northmen a few weeks prior rode to meet Kolak. The legion thundered across the icy plains, fevered with battle lust. They clashed with the Cathayans. The humans dug their heels deep into the snow and pushed back. Tigermen swarmed dragon ogres. Lancers faced giants. Everywhere, the Cathayans faced the monstrous creations of the Chaos gods, and they rose to the occasion. Kolak towered above the melee, his great maul bursting bodies with every terrible swing. But the general had an answer. Scores of crossbowmen fired constantly, and bolts punched deep into the ancient beast's scaly hide. The fighting built to a fevered pitch, until the Cathayans' advantage was overwhelming. Kolak, knowing death was fast approaching, turned and fled, and his damned legions followed. They were humiliated. The gods, in their hubris, had enacted their schemes and expected the world to bend. But Grand Cathay had rejected these designs and struck back. The forces of Chaos were reeling, but this wasn't even an ounce of what Bhashiva had planned for them. The true might of Cathay was coming. It had been years since Bhashiva had trodden the verdant grasslands of northern Cathay. They weren't how she remembered them. They were tainted. Maybe she could cleanse the corruption, maybe not. Whatever the future for this land, one inevitability came first. She would soak the earth in blood, and it would be born anew. The forces of Tzeentch and Cathay clashed under a sickly violent sky. Vicious cracks of improbable light tore over the heads of the combatants. Lesser demons showered the Cathayans with magic, and Tigermen pressed towards them, denying the Chaos forces their support. Bhashiva and her retinue combed the tree lines and slaughtered the marauders attempting to lay an ambush for the Cathayans. With their reinforcements undone, Tzeentch's forces were driven back. They fled deeper into northern Cathay, hoping their master would spare them for running away. Which he definitely wouldn't. News reached Village the Curseling about the humiliating defeat. He couldn't rely on fools to enact his god's will. He was going to fight his own battles. And by that I mean he was going to let his much stronger brother Tomlin fight while he got a few sneaky jabs in. His force was immense and eager to exact revenge upon the Cathayans. Bhashiva held advantage in the terrain, but she didn't want the high ground, nor the river, nor the choke point. She didn't want to let the Curseling call the shots and come to her. He would play by her rules and at her pace. She sent Tigermen to circle around, while the primary force charged headlong into the Chaos Warriors. Willis planted himself deep in the fray, tearing pockets of devastation into the Cathayan ranks and sending humans cascading away from him. Well, his brother did. Willis helped. Steel and flesh and cosmic incandescence cracked and groaned across the battlefield as polished Cathayan steel and gilded black iron formed a churning, glistening sea. Tzeentch may be the god of trickery, but he wasn't the only one able to put a plan in motion. The melee formed into two main swells, and a surge of Tigermen stalking the confines of the battlefield collided with one. Bhashiva had planned a devastating pincer attack, but she was waylaid, as Willis had attempted the classic Tzeentch trick of hiding an enormous bunch of Chaos Warriors in the trees. It'd work one day, he knew it. After carving them up, Bhashiva flew towards the melee. Willis was unchecked, and around him swirled a whirlpool of death and destruction, while his brother cleaved through armor and flesh, severing arms and legs and spinal columns. Willis threw out puffs of light and smoke, in a showing of force that he deemed completely equal. The swell around Willis was severe, but Bhashiva turned her attention elsewhere. She hit the eastern melee. She tore in deep, reducing the chaos flank to ribbons, and as the last few marauders collapsed or fled, the Cathayans swarmed to the main fight. The cursed brothers were tiring and blundered around the more agile Bhashiva. They fumbled like drunks as the Tiger Queen pulsed and shifted around them, slicing deep with each motion. Willis roared in frustration. The final few Chaos Warriors fled, and as Bhashiva broke her concentration to take in her victory, the brothers were already running into the distance, dripping with blood, shame, and cowardice. As the forces of Tzeentch skulked away, mutated tails and tentacles tucked betwixt their legs, more foes joined the fray. The Chaos Dwarves stirred to the north, and a contingent of the Blessed Dread advanced. Whether a scouting party or a vanguard force, Bhashiva didn't care. They would die either way. A silent night erupted into cacophony as the Iron Hail gunners showered the Druki with shots. Tigermen followed up and carved through the invaders' ranks. The elves had dredged a blood-rack Medusa from some infernal corner of the world, but it broke before Bhashiva. The assault was fast and deadly, and the Druki, realizing what fate awaited them, fled in droves. But they didn't head back to their own lands. No, they ran to the Taoyan and tried to negotiate support. The Chaos Dwarfs aren't known for honoring their arrangements with any integrity, and the gambit showed the elves' desperation. They attacked Bhashiva's retinue once more, and this time the Cathayans lacked the element of surprise. Great stone pillars in the valley divided the land into a narrow strip. Bhashiva's forces could funnel the Druki into a tight knot if they held their composure. The Cathayans waited. Taoyan the Merciless held the vanguard position. She was the spear the Dark Elves would drive themselves upon. As the invaders neared, the gunners unloaded, filling the air with the haze of black powder and the echoing crack of constant iron hail fire. The elves pressed their attack, and the valley rumbled from both ends. Holding true to their word for once, the Taoyan came to the aid of the Druki, leaving the Cathayans sandwiched between the two advancing armies. The dwarfs' guttural laughs were heard as they saw a lone tigress stand to face them, though that mirth was silenced a second later when she was in their midst and tearing them limb from limb. The dwarves turned their attention inward, away from the tree line, and away from the hundreds of Tigermen and Cathayan soldiers roaring into them. In seconds, their confidence and advantage was shattered. They buckled beneath a sudden swell of bestial bodies. Upon seeing their allies' assault stopped dead, the Druki, brave as always, turned tail and ran. Swelling with confidence and eager for blood sport, the Cathayans followed, shooting, cutting, and immolating elves in scores. Minutes. It took only minutes for the cursed coalition of the Taoyan and Druki to fall apart. A message was signed in blood. Whatever odds you stack against Grand Cathay, she will not back down. Northern Cathay once stood proud and resolute, a defiant gem atop this grand nation's crown. The Chaos Invasion had reduced it to cinders, and the former warden of the land, Miao Ying, had disappeared, though it's assumed she died horribly. Her former seat of power was seized and desecrated. Nangao was the key to retaking the north. and Bhashiva would have it back. The city's original denizens were displaced, killed, or worse, and the streets were awash with villainy and blasphemy. As the reclamation force advanced, disarray stirred behind the walls as a white blur dashed down the streets and side passages, lopping off arms and legs as it went. The commotion allowed the Cathayans to dock on the walls unimpeded, and you'd figure this an easy win for Bhashiva's forces, but they didn't want to leave anything to chance. A second force assaulted from the south, bombarding the gates with their great cannons, ignoring the fact that they were technically blowing up their own city. Well, if they hadn't built it so well, they wouldn't have needed so many cannons. The breached doorways spilled Tigermen into the city, which swept away the defending Chaos forces. Nangao, while slightly smashed and canonized, was to be civilized again. The city would become Bhashiva's base of operations in northern Cathay, though there was little time to linger, as troubling news had come. The Taoyan dispatched an unprecedented force. It rumbled through the Chaos Wastes, towards the tattered remains of the Great Bastion. Though that gave Bhashiva an ingenious plan. Why not just rebuild the Bastion? What would that take? A few hours? A day, tops? How hard could it be? A few hours later, or maybe a day, tops, and the Bastion was rebuilt. The architectural genius of the Tigermen was staggering, even to themselves. But there was no time to gloat, nor to take in their unmistakable brilliance. The Chaos Dwarfs began their assault. The grim war host himself, Zhatan the Black, sent a message ahead of his assault, promising to defile the corpse of every man, woman, and child of Cathay if he broke through. Bhashiva sent back one word, scrawled on parchment. If. Behind the gates, Bhashiva waited restlessly alongside her trusted lieutenants. This day would go down in history, if there were anyone left to record it. As the Taoyan neared, the great cannons of the Bastion creaked to life and fired. Iron Hail gunners on the wall tracked the advance and unleashed round after round. The swell of bodies was undaunted. Through a hail of iron shot and cannon fire, the dwarfs surged towards the wall. Bhashiva knew what she must do. A bright flash from their rear caught the dwarf's attention, and in the fraction it took them to turn and face, that flash evolved into a whirling dervish of gore. The tigress led a band of them away, and as they turned, the gunners fired into their backs, bringing a dozen down. The move staggered the attacking line. They had stumbled, but they pushed forth. They docked their ladders on the walls, and the allure erupted into carnage. Bhashiva dragged her pursuers back to the gate. She demanded the great doors swing open, and her iron-claw tiger warriors clashed with the dwarves. It was a brutal struggle, one that tickled Zhatan in a sadistic way, and atop his dread lamassu, he joined the fray. He let loose a cackle that sounded like grinding iron, and brought a war horn to his lips and blew. Its response came moments later. A second attacking army pushed towards the walls, intent on pressing the swell to burst. Bhashiva had torn a great bloody gash through the initial assault, and finally she called for aid. The gates buckled and broke, and through the dust and debris came every last tiger warrior of her retinue. Flooding away from the bastion, they swarmed the approaching forces. The walls were lost, but the dwarves could have them. The Tigermen tired of waiting. They wanted to hunt. The surprise assault sent shouts of disarray rippling across the lines. Zhatan bellowed furiously, but he could do nothing. Taoyan the Merciless held him in place. The balefire of his infernal mount washed over her, and she lived up to her namesake, striking relentless and deadly. The gates were battered and broken. The walls were in tatters. Cathayans lay strewn across the walls and battlefield, but the Bastion had held. They had defeated the war host of Shah, and Cathay stood for one more day. Of the cursed trifecta that united to bring down the nation, only one remained. The bells tolled for Lokir's demise, but try as she might, she couldn't find the dread captain anywhere. She scoured the heartlands, the coast, even barged in and desecrated his personal residence. Nothing. She had an idea. You don't catch a rat by chasing it. You lure it into a trap. And if there's one thing Lokir can't resist, it's a bit of depraved brutality. Bhashiva tracked down and ambushed a force of Druki, utterly annihilating them. She strung up the captives and executed them in violent manners that would typically raise eyebrows. It was deemed an acceptable line to cross, as sure enough, it drew the dread captain out of hiding, eager to show up Bhashiva's acts of cruelty with some of his own. His followers were legion, every one of them tempered in their captain's image to be the very model of sadistic malice. The Cathayans advanced, uncertain but determined, while the White Tiger watched on from her vantage point, ready to pounce. She struck, causing an echo of panic, while the Tigermen slammed in and drove deep, ignoring the chaos unfolding beneath him. Lokir soared overhead, landing amidst the gunners and crossbowmen, causing havoc. Bhashiva doubled back towards him, and with barely a showdown, he commanded his Black Dragon Maelstrom take to the air, and Bhashiva could not resist following. The battle raged on without them. Bloody carnage in dense pockets as man, elf, and tiger staggered and fought in the downpour. In the distance, flashes of light as Bhashiva and Lokir clashed with intense ferocity. She dodged the dragon's lumbering movements, landing precise strikes upon its neck and forelegs. It rippled in pain and reared, lunging for her, but she was gone before its jaws snapped shut. Lokir tracked the tiger, convinced he had a position locked down. He commanded Maelstrom's strike. Bhashiva slipped back and drove her smoldering blades into the dragon's neck. The beast bucked and flung Lokir from the saddle, with the fall killing him instantly. The beast slumped to the cold, wet earth, and Bhashiva took a beat before charging back into the fray. She carved her way into the midst of battle, and a sickening reality hit her. Lokir's plan had worked. He'd had a second force reinforce the battle, and she'd done nothing about it. The Cathayans were falling apart. They'd persevered through grit and steel and unbounded determination, but they'd finally met their limit. Her army was cut down and scattered, but a few held out. Taoyan the Merciless would not flee. If Cathay were to fall, then she'd fall with it. Bhashiva gravitated towards her. They'd leave this world, knowing they had nothing more to give. They fought uninhibited, letting every ounce of spite and savagery overcome them, until they were the only Cathayans left on the field, and the Druki kept coming. Vast geysers of gore erupted, and the earth became a dank, ensanguinated mire. Every time the elves thought victory was theirs, a flash of steel rippled across their ranks and showered them with viscera. And then they could take no more. The elves began to flee, leaving the two Cathayan dealers of death alone amidst a sea of corpses. They'd snatched victory from the jaws of defeat, but the price paid was astronomical. But defending your home, your traditions, your culture, history, livelihoods, safeguarding your way of life from the insidious forces of chaos, well, that will always demand a heavy price. No matter how much blood and flesh and steel and anguish it cost, Bhashiva would pay it, for the alternative was just too grim. Grand Cathay had suffered deeply at the hands of the ruinous powers and their allies, the Dark Elves, the Chaos Dwarves, the forces of Nurgle and Tzeentch. They weren't defeated by any stretch, but the orchestrators of Cathay's doom were disposed of. The nation was ablaze, but those fires could be extinguished, and from the ashes, a more resilient country would be rebuilt. In the following weeks, the remaining invaders buckled and were driven back, and Cathay was reclaimed, mile by mile. The forces of chaos were swallowing the world, but Grand Cathay had made a stand. Led by Zhao Ming, with Bhashiva as his right hand, a new defiant age dawned. Whether it would be enough, time would tell. But they had made a grave proclamation. The only way Cathay will fall is if the world falls with it. Maybe the ruinous powers would take them up on that.